I want you to pause for a moment and picture this. A former president, someone who has spent decades building an image of power and success, suddenly erupts online, furious, frantic, unfiltered, not because of a scandal rumor, not because of an election loss, but because Congress, doing exactly what the Constitution tells it to do, has demanded the truth. I've watched politics for a long time, and when someone reacts like this, it's never about pride, it's about fear. Fear that sunlight is coming. Fear that a carefully constructed financial story built over 25 years may not survive scrutiny. This is not political theater. This is not noise. This is the system quietly moving its pieces into place. Bipartisan, methodical, relentless. If you care about accountability, about whether power still has limits, stay with me. And if conversations like this matter to you, this is the moment to engage, to share, to listen closely. Because to understand what just happened, we need to step back and ask a more uncomfortable question. How did we get here in the first place? We need to be precise about what this moment actually represents. Strip away the shouting, the social media rage, the partisan reflexes. What you are looking at is not a personality clash. It is a collision between personal power and institutional authority. For decades, Donald Trump has treated financial opacity as a shield. His wealth was a narrative, not a balance sheet. Success was asserted, not demonstrated. And that strategy worked until oversight stopped being theoretical and became operational. Congress did not stumble into this. It moved deliberately, quietly. Lawyers first, accountants second, votes last. The point was not to embarrass a man, but to test a system. Can democratic institutions still function when the subject is powerful, polarizing, and running for president again? That is why this vote matters more than the headlines suggest. It signals a shift in incentives. Loyalty is no longer the safest option. Silence is no longer neutral. For the first time in years, some lawmakers calculated that defending the institution mattered more than protecting the individual. And once that calculation changes, the story stops being about Trump and starts being about the system that created him. To understand why this moment feels so volatile, you have to look backward, not at personalities, but at patterns. This did not begin with a single vote or a single post online. It began years ago when financial transparency stopped being a norm and became a battlefield. For half a century, presidential candidates released their tax returns as a matter of course. Not because they were forced to, but because legitimacy required it. That tradition created trust, and trust reduced risk. Donald Trump was the first modern candidate to reject that logic entirely. From the beginning, his finances were treated not as public accountability, but as private leverage. Every request was framed as persecution. Every inquiry became an attack. Courts, prosecutors, journalists, even congressional committees were cast as enemies rather than safeguards. What changed over time was not the scrutiny, it was the accumulation. Each fight added documents. Each loss produced findings. Each delay raised new questions. And slowly, a simple reality emerged. When transparency is resisted at every stage, institutions eventually respond by widening the lens. That is the context for today. This vote did not appear suddenly. It is the result of years of unresolved questions stacking on top of each other until the system could no longer look away. And that brings us to the first real rupture, when quiet concern turned into open confrontation. The first rupture happened behind closed doors, not under television lights. For hours, lawmakers sat in a sealed room listening not to politicians, but to forensic accountants and legal specialists. No speeches, no slogans, just numbers, documents, and inconsistencies laid out piece by piece. What they heard was not an accusation. It was something more dangerous, a pattern. Valuations that rose when loans were requested and fell when taxes were due. Assets described one way to banks and another way to tax authorities. Not proof of guilt, but enough smoke to justify looking for fire. This is where the mood shifted. Oversight stopped being abstract. It became unavoidable. When financial experts tell you the story doesn't line up, ignoring it is no longer neutral. It becomes complicity. That is why the vote that followed mattered so much. 6 Republicans crossed a line Trump had treated as immovable, not out of rebellion, but out of self-preservation. They understood something crucial. If institutions refuse to act when evidence points to risk, they don't stay neutral. They collapse. If you're still with me, pause and consider what that means. Because once that line is crossed, there's no quiet way back. And from there, the real question shifts from what happened to how the system allowed it to go on for so long. What makes this so difficult to confront is that the system Trump used was never chaotic. It was methodical. Financial opacity wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. Here's how it works. Complex business structures scatter information across dozens of entities. Valuations become flexible narratives instead of fixed truths. Debt looks like leverage when you're selling success, and like loss when you're minimizing taxes. Each filing, taken alone, can be defended. Each transaction, isolated, looks technical. But when you line them up over decades, patterns emerge. This is why transparency is the real threat. Not because it guarantees guilt, but because it removes the ability to selectively explain. Forensic accounting isn't about catching one lie. It's about comparing stories told to different audiences and seeing where they collide. Institutions tolerate this behavior longer than they should because challenging it is costly, legal fights drag on, political backlash is real. And as long as the subject can frame oversight as persecution, doubt spreads faster than facts. But systems have limits. When the same individual resists transparency in courtrooms, in legislatures, and in public discourse, eventually the resistance itself becomes evidence of risk. And once that realization sets in, escalation stops being a choice. It becomes inevitable, which leads directly to the next flashpoint, when pressure turned into open confrontation and the stakes sharply increased. The second escalation didn't arrive quietly. It arrived with consequences that could no longer be contained inside committee rooms. Once subpoenas were authorized, the scope expanded, and with it, the danger. This was no longer about a few tax returns. It was about 25 years of financial life, personal income, business entities, banking relationships, and most critically, foreign dealings that intersect with national security. At that point, the story stopped being domestic politics and became something far more serious. Because money leaves footprints, loans reveal dependencies, foreign transactions reveal leverage. And when someone seeking the presidency has unresolved financial ties abroad, oversight is not optional, it is mandatory. This is where panic makes sense. Fighting disclosure is rational if disclosure threatens more than embarrassment. Every document released doesn't just inform Congress. It invites prosecutors, regulators, and foreign governments to look again. The ripple effects are uncontrollable. And notice what changed next. The defense shifted from legal argument to intimidation. Public threats, naming names, targeting lawmakers who broke ranks. That's not confidence, that's desperation. When institutions press forward despite that pressure, something fundamental is happening. Authority is reasserting itself. And once that happens, the focus inevitably turns outward away from elites and toward the people who absorb the consequences. Because systems don't fail in isolation, they fail through lives. And that's where this story becomes personal. Now, I want you to think about this not as a headline, but as a human cost. Because when financial power operates without transparency, it never stays abstract. It lands on ordinary people first. You pay taxes on every paycheck because the system tells you it's non-negotiable. You follow rules you didn't write, trusting that those at the top play by them too. When that trust breaks, the damage isn't theoretical, it's corrosive. It tells people that power buys exemption, that rules are for the weak, not the well-connected. And when leaders hide financial risk, you carry it unknowingly. Markets wobble. Institutions lose credibility. Public anger rises. Polarization deepens. People stop believing accountability exists at all. That's when cynicism replaces participation and democracy starts to hollow out. This is why transparency matters to you, even if you never cared about Trump, because unchecked financial secrecy at the top always trickles down as instability at the bottom. If this resonates, if you've ever felt the system holds you to standards it excuses in others, stay with me, share this conversation, keep your attention here, because what happens next doesn't stay inside America's borders. When financial opacity reaches this level, the shockwaves don't stop at national borders. Money is global, risk is global, and credibility, once damaged, travels fast. Allies watch this closely because it tells them whether American institutions can still police their own power. Adversaries watch even more closely, looking for leverage, weakness, or opportunity. If financial ties exist, even historically, they become pressure points, not hypotheticals, tools. Banks reassess exposure. Markets price in uncertainty. Foreign governments quietly revisit past dealings, asking whether information they hold could suddenly matter. This is how private financial risk mutates into geopolitical vulnerability. And remember, this is happening while Trump seeks power again. That's the multiplier. Every unresolved question becomes a strategic liability. Every hidden transaction becomes a bargaining chip someone else may already possess. This is why the bipartisan nature of the subpoenas matters so much internationally. It signals that oversight is not collapsing into tribal politics. It tells the world that institutions are still capable of acting even when it's uncomfortable. If that signal fails, the consequences are severe. It teaches future leaders that secrecy is survivable, that resistance works, that power outlasts accountability. And that brings us to the hardest part of this story. What comes next? Because from here, the future splits clearly into three possible paths. From this point forward, the system has only three directions it can move. No rhetoric, no spin, just outcomes. The first path is accountability. Courts enforce the subpoenas, documents are produced. Irregularities, if they exist, are confronted openly. The process is messy, slow, and politically painful, but it restores a basic principle. Transparency is not optional for those seeking power. In this scenario, institutions regain credibility, even if individuals fall. The second path is partial exposure. Legal delays succeed just long enough to blunt momentum. Some documents emerge, others remain buried. The truth comes out in fragments, fueling suspicion without resolution. Trust erodes further, not because wrongdoing is proven, but because clarity is denied. This is the most destabilizing outcome because uncertainty breeds cynicism. The third path is defiance. Subpoenas are stalled indefinitely, oversight fails, power outlasts process. If that happens, the lesson is unmistakable. Loyalty beats law, and financial secrecy is survivable if you're influential enough. That precedent doesn't end with Trump. It spreads. Which path becomes reality won't be decided by outrage or headlines. It will be decided by whether institutions endure sustained pressure without flinching. And that brings us to the final question, not about Trump, but about the system itself. Because how this ends will tell us whether accountability still has teeth or whether it has already been negotiated away. So let's close this where it truly belongs, not with a personality, but with a principle. This moment was never just about Donald Trump. It's about whether financial transparency is still a requirement for power or merely a suggestion for those without influence. It's about whether institutions can function when pressure is loud, personal, and relentless. And it's about whether voters get to see the full picture before being asked once again to hand over authority. If these records come out, the story will be uncomfortable for everyone. But discomfort is the price of accountability. If they don't, the message is even clearer and far more dangerous, that power can outlast scrutiny and that rules bend when pushed hard enough. I've spent my career studying systems. And systems don't collapse in dramatic explosions. They erode quietly when exceptions become habits and norms become optional. What happens next will echo far beyond one man, one party, or one election. It will shape what future leaders believe they can hide and what citizens are allowed to know. If you want to understand power, don't watch what it says. Watch what it refuses to reveal. Stay engaged, share this, pay attention to what follows, because the truth doesn't disappear when it's delayed. It only becomes more expensive when it finally arrives.